What's going on there, YouTube, and welcome back to another comic book video. All right, guys, so we are going to continue our coverage over Supreme Power. Now, remember, Supreme Power was originally the origin for the Squadron Supreme. Let me explain. So back in the 1960s, Marvel had this idea where basically they wondered what would happen if the Avengers fought against the Justice League, which honestly is a very interesting question. The problem was, though, Marvel could not use the characters from DC Comics in their books. And so what Marvel did was they created a bunch of characters who will basically represent DC characters. So Hyperion is Superman, Nighthawk is Batman, Blur is Flash, Zarda is Wonder Woman. Now, with all that being said, though, over the years in Marvel Comics, we had different versions of those characters of the Squadron Supreme from different universes across the multiverse to fight against the Avengers, to basically answer the question, what would happen if the Avengers had fought against the Justice League? Now, with all that being said, though, in the early 2000s, Marvel launched Marvel Max. Now, Marvel Max was this great idea where basically Marvel was trying to do more adult comics, like Punisher Max, where basically it's more adult books, more blood, more graphic, naked people, all that stuff. Now, one of the titles was Supreme Power, what we have been covering on this channel. Now, when it comes to Supreme Power, they hired the writer JMS, the same guy who wrote Spider-Man in the early 2000s, to come over and to basically give us the origin of the Squadron Supreme. Now, Supreme Power was somewhat popular to the point that it was able to create a bunch of spinoffs. Dr. Spectrum, Nighthawk spinoff, a Hyperion spinoff, Hyperion versus Nighthawk, and on top of that, a second Supreme Power miniseries. But basically, once Marvel was done with all those different books, they came out and said, all these books right here are technically about a different version of the Squadron Supreme in the Marvel multiverse. Meaning that if we do see another Squadron Supreme, there is a possibility that those characters are different from these right here. Because in the Marvel multiverse, you do have a bunch of different versions of the Squadron Supreme. But either way, though, we're covering Supreme Power. Now, like I said earlier, Supreme Power was originally used to kind of tell the origin of different characters from the Squadron Supreme. So like Hyperion, Blur, and Nighthawk, Zarda, a lot of different characters. Now, when it came to Supreme Power, though, the earlier stories really did focus on the origins of these different characters. And so if you go back and watch my previous videos, you do learn a lot about Hyperion, Nighthawk, Zarda, Dr. Spectrum, but now it's time for them to come together to basically stop a villain. It's time for them to face their first actual supervillain. And this is actually very huge because when it comes to the Squadron Supreme universe, their bad guys were originally just regular bad people. People with no powers. But now you're talking about the idea that there's somebody out there with powers very similar to Hyperion. And that right there is very dangerous because that means there's somebody out there who's able to go toe to toe with Hyperion. And on top of that, Hyperion represents Superman in these comics. And so the question is now, how can our characters, not heroes yet, can come together to basically defeat this new super villain? And so getting into today's storyline, we actually do pick up with Hyperion and Nighthawk. Now, with Hyperion and Nighthawk being characters who were basically made to represent Superman and Batman, you would think that these two characters would actually be best friends. But they're not. In reality, Nighthawk hates Hyperion. And the reason why, because when it comes to Nighthawk, he watched his parents be killed off by some racist white people. And so for Nighthawk, everybody who is white or who's part of the government system cannot be trusted. And with Hyperion being both white and also being part of the government system, this is Nighthawk kind of not really trusting Hyperion. but at the same time, he realized he has no choice but to actually work with Hyperion if they're going to actually be able to stop this supervillain that is going around the area and basically killing off sex workers. Now remember, that is how Nighthawk and Blur found out about this supervillain. There's somebody going around being able to kill off sex workers, but when he does kill them off, he basically rips off their arm. Not cut off, rips off. And that tells Nighthawk and Blur that whoever is doing this must have the same power set as Hyperion, because now you're talking about the idea of ripping somebody's arm off. Now, of course, you do have Nighthawk say that he is going to work with Hyperion to only be able to stop this guy, but at the same time still, it is Nighthawk saying, I do not trust you because you work for the government. Now, Nighthawk has no idea that Hyperion has stepped away from the government. And the reason why, because Hyperion found out that the government has been lying to him. Because remember, the government told Hyperion that he was from America, his parents basically gave birth to him, he had powers, and they're going to help him kind of control his powers. But he found out that he is an alien and that he crashed on Earth and the government was only using him as a weapon. And so now he no longer works for the government. And so this is him kind of telling Nighthawk in his own way, like, hey man, listen, things change. I'm technically no longer with the American government. Now, we actually do pick up with two guys right now going to the apartment of Hyperion, or what was his apartment, because in our last video, we actually saw Hyperion burn down the place, because this place was also given to him by the American government as a place to stay. Now, of course, he burned that down because he hates everything the American government actually stands for at the moment. Either way, though, you do have these two guys kind of looking around the apartment, kind of upset with what Hyperion did. And they feel like Hyperion actually owes them, because it was these two guys and other people who gave Hyperion everything he wanted in life, especially the government giving him fake parents, fake money, fake items, all these different things to kind of give him the easy life. But you didn't have one of the two guys tell the other guy, you're actually in the wrong here, because to Hyperion, we had lied to him, and now he knows the truth. He's now unstoppable, and technically he no longer needs us. Now, the other guy, the blonde guy, wonders why the bald guy said that Hyperion no longer needs them. And he's kind of like, we already know when it comes to Hyperion that he does not need to eat nor sleep. He's basically always energized, and on top of that, who is going to stop him from going to different places that he actually wants to go to? And it shows that now Hyperion is truly free to do whatever he actually wants. Now, that is the moment where we actually do pick up with a lieutenant who's kind of like in charge of this case of this supervillain that is going around killing off sex workers in the area. Now, he is confronted by Hyperion, and this is Hyperion trying to get more information about this supervillain. Now, you do have the lieutenant actually tell Hyperion some very important things, like when it comes to killers, you usually have two kinds of killers, the ones who are organized and the ones who are not organized. But when it comes to this guy right here, he's both, because usually if you're organized killer, you basically take your time planning out your killing, days, weeks, months, years, whatever. But if you're not organized, it's all about the rage. You're full of rage when you're trying to kill somebody off. And so when it comes to this guy right here, he's both. There's times where he is organized, but then there are times when he's not organized. And there's also times when he's both, where it does seem like he planned out his next killing, but something happened where he then goes full rage mode. Now, you do have the lieutenant say that he was able to actually run the fingerprints, and it came back to a character known as Michael Redstone. Now, Michael Redstone is a character who apparently died 3 years ago. And that right there is actually very important because it ties into something we talked about in our last video, which I'm going to bring up later on in this video. as we covered the origin of Michael Redstone. But they said that this guy was in the military and he died 3 years ago after going into prison. And so the question is, though, if the fingerprints come back to a guy who is dead, then how in the world is he around here right now killing people left and right? But then we actually pick up with Blur. Now remember, Blur represents the Flash in these comics. But on top of that, though, Blur has teamed up with Nighthawk and Hyperion as a 3-man force to basically stop this supervillain. And so you do have Blur right now going around the areas to kind of gather more intel about the different sex workers who had disappeared, hoping that it'll be able to give them some kind of information on to find this guy and to hopefully stop him. Now, here comes this weird section though. Because Blur has never truly been with any kind of girls, when he's with these other sex workers, they make him very uncomfortable, and he's kind of like, listen, I know you guys want to take me somewhere and do some things with me, but listen, we cannot do that. But of course, as they talk, the more and more he does become uncomfortable. Either way, though, he was able to get some information that does tell him that you do have a lot of sex workers now kind of leaving the work life behind because they are afraid about being killed off by this mysterious guy who is going around capturing sex workers, killing them, and then ripping off their arms. But then we pick up with Dr. Steedman. Now remember, Dr. Steedman was actually the lead scientist in the Project Hyperion thing that was going on with the American government. When Hyperion first crashed, he was the scientist who was testing Hyperion powers over and over again. Now, Dr. Steedman also helped create Dr. Spectrum. And what I mean by that is, when it came to Dr. Spectrum, he was this random army guy who was brought in to test the crystal, the same crystal that was the power source to Hyperion's spaceship that brought Hyperion to Earth. Now, of course, when Joseph Ledger had tested the crystal, it then had embedded in his hand, and then made him Dr. Spectrum and gave him a bunch of different powers. Now, with that being said, though, in our last video, Dr. Steedman found out that there was this rogue group of scientists who worked for the military who took this virus that was found on Hyperion's spaceship and began to give this virus to different people to see if they would get powers. And of course, all those people were military people who went to prison. Now that right there is actually very important because Michael Redstone was one of those people. But of course, those people, some of them got out. They broke out of the prison and got away. And it seems like Michael Redstone was one of those characters that had broke out and got away. And now, thanks to the virus, he does have a set of powers that makes him rival to Hyperion. Now, with all that being said, Dr. Steedman found out that Nighthawk, Blur, and Hyperion are looking for Michael Redstone. And so what he is doing is he is going to send in Dr. Spectrum to basically, hopefully, capture Redstone before Hyperion, Nighthawk, and Blur do. But then we pick up with Nighthawk. Now you do have Nighthawk right now kind of interrogating this pimp, because if sex workers are disappearing because of basically some supervillain who's going around killing off these sex workers, then their pimps are no longer making money, which means that the pimps may have some kind of information on what is happening to their sex workers and which area is being hit the most. And so you do have this random sex worker that Nighthawk is interrogating, and he does tell Nighthawk that basically when it comes to some sex workers, if they get too old or they have some kind of diseases, they go to this one particular area where sex workers go to die. And not literally, but like their careers are gone. And so the problem is, though, a lot of sex workers who go there, they actually do end up missing. And so that tells Nighthawk, okay, if our mysterious killer is going around killing off women who are sex workers, he goes there because usually their careers are basically over in the line of sex. And that information was actually solid because we actually do pick up with a sex worker, and by her appearance, what the pimp said earlier is true. That if you go to work in this area, it really means that your career is possibly over in the line of sex work. Because right now, by her appearance, she does look kind of defeated. Now, you do have her get picked up by this random guy in a truck. Now, we already know this random guy is our supervillain, the one known as Michael Redstone, who possibly has been going around killing off sex workers and then ripping off their arms. And so she does go inside his truck and he does drive them back to his house, the same house we saw in our last video. Either way, though, he was actually followed by Nighthawk. I almost call him a different name. Either way, he was followed by Nighthawk, and Nighthawk now knows where he lives. And so you do have Nighthawk try to call in Hyperion to basically stop this guy. And so, unfortunately for Nighthawk, he does get his butt kicked by Michael Redstone because Michael Redstone overheard Nighthawk call out for help to Hyperion. Because we have to remember that when it comes to Hyperion, he's basically represents Superman, which means that he possibly has super hearing. And so if Michael Redstone is some guy who may have the same powers as Hyperion, that means he possibly has super hearing as well. And so it does lead into a battle. You know what? Scratch that. This is not even a battle at all, because honestly, it's a beatdown for Nighthawk. Because as soon as Michael overheard Nighthawk call for help, Michael popped out of his house and began to beat down on Nighthawk. And that is why I say it is not a battle. Because to me, a battle is when you have two characters being able to lay punches on each other. Unfortunately, right now, you have Nighthawk being unable to lay a punch on this guy. And so you have Michael actually get ready to kill off Nighthawk. Luckily for Nighthawk, that is the moment you do have Hyperion flying in. But before we actually jump into the battle between Hyperion and Michael Redstone, we actually do pick up with General Alexander. Now, this is going to be the new general for the rest of Supreme Power. And remember, the last general, General Casey, had died at the end of the very beginning or the middle part of Volume 2. Because remember, that was the moment where Hyperion found out that he was lied to his entire life. That basically he's not American nor a regular human being. That basically he's from space. And the American government was trying to use him as a weapon. And so when he tried to confront General Casey, Casey tried to blow him up. And of course, it did not work. It almost did, but not completely. And so now you have a new general stepping in. But this new general, Alexander, he's ticked off. And the reason why he is ticked off because he has seen what the government or the military had basically failed at, which is Project Hyperion, because they tried to do an approach where they tried to be nice with the alien and make the alien believe that he's part of the human race, that he's actually American. And when I say alien, I mean Hyperion. But it's the general saying, look at what you guys tried to do and where we at right now. That we have lost Hyperion. Now we have this other guy in Chicago known as Nighthawk. There's also Blur, but Blur does not work for us. He works for some kind of agency that basically makes some money as long as companies are trying to promote him. And on top of that, we had a rogue group of scientists try to use the alien virus for their own personal needs, and look what happened. Now we have a crazy guy out there causing more problems for us. Do y'all realize what you guys have done under the last general? A whole lot of you know what. And so basically this is Alexander becoming the more strict general. Kind of like, I am not going to sit here and allow you guys to cause more problems for the American government, but also the military. And so we need to actually fix all of your mistakes, because the only thing we have right now in our possession is Dr. Spectrum, and that is it. Now, you do have Dr. Steedman inform the general that basically he does have Dr. Spectrum on side on the sideline, sorry, to get ready to actually grab Michael Redstone once Hyperion, Nighthawk, and Blur are able to actually defeat Redstone. And when they do defeat Redstone, then you'll have Dr. Spectrum come in and grab Redstone and get him out of there before the public wonders why in the world were there two characters fighting against one another. Talking about, of course, Hyperion and Redstone, because they're both really two powerful characters. Now, the rest of issue number 14, not the rest, but most of the pages in issue number 14 is really more of our heroes fighting against Michael Redstone. Now, at first, you do have Hyperion go in and try to fight against Michael Redstone. Here comes the big problem, though. Michael Redstone is basically a character who is on the same level as Hyperion. And that right there is actually scary, because now you're basically saying that there's somebody out there who is Hyperion, who is strong as Hyperion, fast as Hyperion. And so while you have Hyperion trying to fight against Michael Redstone, he is actually struggling because he never fought against somebody who is literally just like him. Now, Nighthawk honestly can't help out much here because Nighthawk is really more just a regular guy in the way. And this shows what JMS is trying to say about Batman, really. Because remember, when it comes to Nighthawk, Nighthawk represents Batman, and Batman is just a guy with a bunch of tech to use to help bring down supervillains. But the problem is, though, Batman is just a regular guy. And so is JMS saying, in reality, if this was the real thing, superheroes and supervillains, someone like Batman and Nighthawk would basically be pointless in actually helping out to defeat someone like Michael Redstone. Now, Blur does help out a tad bit, but again, it all comes down to Hyperion. And so while this battle does last for a few pages across different cities in America, you do have our heroes actually being able to defeat Michael Redstone. Now, the way they actually do is because they cut off his airways, basically putting a lot of pudding or something in his mouth to basically help him stop breathing just long enough that he goes unconscious. And once he does pass out, they basically put a straw in there in this kind of pudding in his mouth to make an airway so that he'll be able to actually breathe once again. But for right now, he is knocked out. But it did take all three characters to basically work together to bring down this guy. And this shows that if Hyperion goes bad, it could be really hard for Blur and Nighthawk, because Hyperion does have more experience with his powers. Now, right after the battle, you do have Dr. Spectrum actually appear. Now, when he does appear, you do have Dr. Spectrum just go ahead and take Michael Redstone away with him. Now, of course, you do have Nighthawk very upset with the idea that basically somebody from the government is once again coming in and just taking away the person that he has stopped, but the person he feels like needs to go through the actual American justice system. Now, of course, for Hyperion and Blur, they realize that if Dr. Spectrum is coming in here and he works for the American government and they're trying to take away Michael Redstone, it's probably the best option. And the reason why, because they possibly have some kind of way to actually lock him up, to keep Michael Redstone locked away from the rest of the world. And so with that information being said, you do have Dr. Spectrum he does take away Michael Redstone. You do have Blur get upset with Nighthawk because Nighthawk's kind of like saying Blur and Hyperion are basically useless heroes because they allow Dr. Spectrum to take away Michael Redstone. But we do see that the American government does have a way to actually contain Michael Redstone. And so right now, he is locked away for the time being. And so getting into the last chapter for today's video, we actually do pick up right now with the general meeting up with Michael in Michael's new prison cell. Now, this prison was actually made as a way to hold Hyperion just in case they ever needed to lock up Hyperion. And so with that, they made this prison as a way to hold Hyperion. And when it comes to this prison, it's basically pumping in a bunch of chemicals are a certain kind of chemical that is 5 times heavier than air. Now that right there is actually very important because it shows that when it came to the American government and military, they realized that they needed some kind of way to actually stop Hyperion. But the problem was, though, they couldn't find a way. Because even though Hyperion does represent Superman in these comics, unlike Superman, we have not seen that one kind of thing that could basically weaken Hyperion. And so what they did was they realized that when it comes to Hyperion, he has to breathe. If he cannot breathe, he'll basically die. And so what they did was they made this prison where it is 5 times harder to breathe in. And so with that happening right now to Michael, he is unable to actually focus on using his different powers to basically escape. And so right now, Michael is just stuck in there. And if he ever tries to escape, then the cell release more of this chemical that makes it even harder for him to breathe, which could possibly kill him. And so this is right now the general wanting to have a conversation with Michael about his origin, but on top of that, a future mission down the road. But then we jump over to Hyperion and Nighthawk. Now, this conversation is actually very important. And the reason why, because you have Nighthawk explaining to Hyperion why he's so upset with Hyperion. And the reason why Nighthawk is upset with Hyperion is because basically it looks like that another white serial killer was able to walk away freely without actually facing the American justice system. Now, to Hyperion, he's kind of like, what do you mean? He got taken away by the American military because they're the best people to actually hold someone like that. But to Nighthawk, he knows how the system works when it comes to the government and the military. Yes, it may look like they're going to lock him away forever, but instead they're going to basically use him as some kind of weapon down the road to take out different enemies from different countries. And so it's Nighthawk wanting Hyperion to realize where he messed up at. Yes, you may think that the American government is actually going to go through the process of making sure that he stays locked away. But knowing them, they're going to basically use him as a weapon. And right there, it shows that another white serial killer is able to get a free walk after killing mostly black sex workers. Now, in the earlier chapters, it wasn't really mentioned that he killed black sex workers the most, but now we're being told by Nighthawk here that yes, he has killed mostly black sex workers. There were some whites, but mostly black. And that right there is a huge problem for Nighthawk. Because again, when it comes to Nighthawk, yes, he is a hero in Chicago, but he really only protects black people, not any other race. And so when he hears that a white serial killer is able to get away freely, that right there is not fair. Now, he also talks bad about Blur. And the reason why, because even though Blur is also black, what he says is that when it comes to Blur and Nighthawk, they're two different people. That basically, when it comes to Blur will do anything to help out the white man. But when it comes to Nighthawk, he'll help the white man out, but he'll be aware to watch his back around the white man and not try to please the white man so easily. But when it comes to Blur will do anything to please the white man. And so with all that being said, it's Blur hearing that, getting ticked off by Nighthawk and kind of like, you know what? This friendship, this partnership, it's over. And he leaves. Now, we actually do pick up with the general. Now, when we do, this is the general kind of giving us the origin of Michael. Now, it is broken up into multiple sections. And so this first section really does focus on how did Michael become a serial killer? And what we learn is that when it came to his first kill of a sex worker, he was basically just hoping to have some fun that night. But of course, while they were having their fun, he on accident had killed her. Now, when he does kill her, instead of freaking out, calling the cops, or trying to run away, he actually observed the body. And he was kind of like, oh my God, this is what I did. It's what I could do to somebody. And so with that passion he had, a very sick passion, he basically began to go around the area that he was in as a soldier on leave. He was pretending to be a soldier on leave. And so when he did that, the other sex workers in the area would feel more comfortable with him, feel more protected by him, because they realized that he was a soldier on leave. But in reality, he was not a soldier on leave. And so anytime a sex worker would fall for his disguise, he would basically grab that sex worker, took her to a place, and then killed her. And so that began his path in becoming a serial killer. Now, you do have Alexander actually stop talking to Michael and go have a conversation with Joseph Ledger, aka Dr. Spectrum. Now, this conversation is actually very important and things we're going to see in the next video. And what I mean by that is because you do have the general right now coming to Joseph Ledger and saying, listen, we have to talk. We have to talk about the idea that you are not the only one special out in the world. Yes, we do have Hyperion. Yes, we do have Blur and Nighthawk in you. But now this is the general finding out that there are now two other people out there who basically have powers and causing problems across the world. The first one is, of course, Amphibian. And remember, Amphibian is kind of like the Aquaman, Aquawoman of this comic book series. But she was a child that came out of her mom deformed, but fell in the ocean and just lived in the ocean forever. Now, we could say that basically, thanks to her mom looking at the spaceship of Hyperion when he first came to Earth, something changed in her pregnancy, which of course led to Amphibian coming out like a monster in her mom's and dad's eyes. But of course, you had the mom just kill herself, but also was trying to kill off Amphibian, but failed. And so you had Amphibian just live in the ocean forever. The other character is Zarda. And remember, Zarda does represent Wonder Woman. But after Zarda had left Hyperion at the end of our last video, she went to a different country, I think it was Italy, and she killed off a bunch of people to basically get things that she wanted, which was clothes, items, whatever. And so this is the general saying, I need you to figure out who these two ladies are and basically bring them in. And so you do have Joseph say, okay, cool, boss, I got it, and I'll bring these two girls in. Now you do have the general actually continue to kind of explain the origin of Michael, or really his killing ways, because what you have the general actually say that when it came to Michael, when he did once join the army, he was confronted by a lady who was his higher up. Now, of course, in the military, your higher up usually yells at you for different things. And so with that being said, he did not like how she had yelled at him. And so with that, he had her killed off. Now, of course, he wouldn't got caught, but the problem was, though, he did put some of her things and body parts in his locker, but buried a lot of body parts where she had actually yelled at him in the middle of the field, where of course somebody had found him. And so it shows that when it comes to women, he hates women especially, but he definitely hates women when they talk to him in some kind of way. And his thought process, he believes that women deserve to basically be killed off if they cross him or any man in some kind of way. But then we actually pick up with Hyperion and Blur. Now, you do have Blur still kind of upset with what Nighthawk said about the two guys, but you didn't have Blur also tell Hyperion that he does understand what Nighthawk is talking about when it comes to the American justice system. That basically it's not fair, it's not perfect, it is crooked. But at the same time though, it is how it is when it comes to the justice system. And so if you're a black person, you honestly just have to keep your head down and try to get away from the crookedness in the American government or justice systems. And so either way, this actually leads into that moment where we saw earlier where one guy said that when it comes to Hyperion, because he's no longer working for the American government and he's no longer being controlled by us, that basically when it comes to Hyperion, he's a free man to do anything he wants to do and nobody can truly stop him. And that shows right here at this diner, because while you have the two characters right now eating food, it does come time to pay. But instead of paying, you have Hyperion actually burn the receipt and kind of show Blur that because nobody can clearly stop him, that he should not be able to follow rules that belong to the human race. And so when the waiter freaks out because he saw Hyperion burn up the receipt, he's kind of like, you know what, it's on the house. I am not going to stop you. And it shows what the guy said earlier. When it comes to Hyperion, he's now somebody that people are not going to try to stop because honestly, you can't stop him. Now, the rest of this section really does kind of wrap up today's video. It wraps up Michael's origin, but also show us what they're going to do with Michael for what seems to be the rest of the series. Because you do have the general basically tell us that after Michael had killed off his superior, his higher up, he was thrown into prison, which does make sense. Except, of course, this ties into what we saw at the end of our last video, where basically you had this rogue group of scientists came in, took the virus from the spaceship that brought Hyperion to Earth and began to use that virus on different people to see if they would gain abilities. And so when you had those scientists do that, they basically took prisoners from different prisons, and of course that meant Michael, and gave him that virus to see if he would gain abilities. Now, before he did, though, when he did arrive at the prison, he did see that some people who were infected by the virus, it worked well on them, because he does see one guy who was shrunk down in size. And of course, that guy right there could represent Ant-Man for Marvel or Captain Atom for DC. And when it comes to the Squadron Supreme, they all usually represent DC characters. Either way, though, you did have some people who got the virus and they died. Now, of course, we know when it came to Michael, when he got the virus, he survived, got the powers, escaped, but he was stopped by, of course, our heroes. Now, this is where you have the general say, listen, we could use somebody like you, somebody who is the perfect killing machine, who won't stop until everybody's dead in that town or in that country or whatever. And that is what we need. And so what they're going to do actually is that they're going to send him around the world as this military weapon to take out different enemies in different parts of the world. But of course, they know that he'll make sure that every single person of that crew they're trying to take out is actually dead. And so it makes him the perfect weapon to actually use. And so it shows that even though that basically our heroes were able to stop him, what Nighthawk said is true earlier, that the system is kind of made to help out white people, but not black people. And once again, another white serial killer, one who was going around killing off black sex workers, is now free again to cause havoc across the world, even though technically he works for the American military. But with that being said, this is where we are going to end today's comic book video. So with that being said, I do hope you enjoyed today's comic book video. And if you did, hit that like button down below and subscribe. But guys, I'll see y'all next time. Later.